Men, welcome to the Alpha Male Podcast. The podcast where we talk about what it means to be a man the right way, with God at the center, Judeo-Christian values, where we get together in this virtual tribe and we don't apologize for what we are, strong, dominant alpha males. Before we get into the day's topic, don't forget to like and subscribe. Also, in order to get you guys better content, a better value, better quality in these podcasts, I stepped down from my full-time management position as a general manager to make this podcast my main source of income. So if you guys think this is worth listening to, hopefully you think it's worth supporting. If you want to, go to goodshepherdtraining.com and there's a Patreon link on there. If you like this kind of talk of me talking at you, we actually have a insider group for the patrons, just a manly chat where we talk back and forth with each other. An inner circle, if you will. So if you don't want to miss out on that, the way to get in on that is Patreon. For as little as $1 a month, you can get on Patreon. What's $1 a month in today's costs of everything going up? Enough of that. I'll plug in the bio and then we'll get into today's topic. If you want to skip the bio because you've heard it before, just don't want to listen, you can skip around 3 minutes and 45 seconds from where we start. First and foremost, I am a servant of God, preacher, a fisher of men. God is number one in my life, and everything that I do in this podcast is no different, and I don't apologize for that. A little bit about me in the background. I grew up, I guess what you would consider a heathen. Didn't grow up a Christian, but I grew up in the southeastern United States, what most would consider very poor. Hunting and fishing and shooting. Joined the Marine Corps at 17, did a couple of combat tours in Iraq. After my combat tours in Iraq, I was an urban warfare instructor for the United States Marine Corps under Mojave Viper. I also served in law enforcement for several years in LAPD. I worked patrol assignments and more specialized assignments, where by God's grace, He got me through some nasty places in this world of war zones and some of the nastiest streets in the country. Not because I am better, because God chose to have mercy on me and had a purpose for me, and I'm thankful for that. After my time in law enforcement, I was a private contractor for federal government, for a 3-letter government agency I won't specify, doing private contracting work. I'm very much involved in guns and gunfighting. I also served in the U.S. Army, both full-time and part-time National Guard. I should say my primary MOS is in both branches of the military or infantry, as of one sort or another. Specialized infantry in the Marine Corps and an MOS that no longer exists. I started competition shooting even before I joined the Marine Corps at 17. I won my first gold medal even before I joined the Marine Corps at 17. I've been blessed by God with the talents He's given me to win more shooting competitions than I can remember. I've won most of my competitions in rifle and pistol, but I've also competed in archery and shotgun and even muzzleloader, knife throwing, hatchet throwing. I've competed in all that. I've also been a professional big game hunter and guide. Like I said, I grew up hunting and fishing and shooting. I've done it to put meat on the table because I like to put food on the table with the talents God's given me. I don't apologize for that. I've done it as a professional hunter and guide. I've slain all manner of beast and guided for all manner of beast. Bear and wolf and elk and deer, mule deer, whitetail deer. I've slain ram and fallow deer and countless animals. And I don't apologize for that either. FBI certified, firearms instructor, NRA, and a bunch of other 3-letter government agency certifications. Blessed be the Lord my rock, who trains my hands for war and my fingers for battle. Psalm 144. I've been blessed to be the commander of a tactical team, an SRT, Special Response Team, in a large metropolitan area, where our primary job was to stop active shooters. But again, first and foremost, I'm a servant of God, called by God to share the good news. All right, man, if you've made it through all that, congratulations. We're about to get into the actual topic. Now, if you want to share an episode with, friends, family, something that's an easy barrier to entry for the Alpha Male podcast, this one might be a good one. It's on a pretty mundane topic. And I know this topic of food preservation, obviously you know the topic because you probably read the title when you clicked on it. But today's topic is not really controversial, I wouldn't think, for anybody. And I know it might not be the most tactical thing. It's not as cool as the next polymer striker-fired gun on Instagram or whatever. But it's probably eminently more practical. You heard my bio. I can count on fingers the number of gunfights I've been in my life. And again, you heard my bio. Even if we think the world is going to become a much more violent place in the future, and that number doubles or triples, it's still far less than the amount of times that I've had to eat in my life. Eating keeps us alive. A lot of people in this alpha male community, I take it, are survivalists. I make no apologies for that. I don't try to sugarcoat that or say that I'm something else. I would like to survive as long as God wants me to survive, and I make no apologies for that. And a lot of people think they're going to hunt, fish, forage their way through the end times. And I'd say good for you. Start doing it now. That's great. I love to hunt, fish, and forage. Don't get me wrong. I love that. If you've ever shot an elk and walked up to it and looked down and realized how massive an animal that is, how much meat is on that animal, what do you do with it? It's one thing. It's a lot of work and a lot of labor and preserving it and getting it ready. In good times, if you have electricity, if you can just go to the grocery store and get all the things to prepare it and make sausage and jerky and all that stuff, if you have refrigeration, you can just cut it up into steaks and freeze it and grind it up into burger. That's all great, but what if you can't do that? Like, what good is 200 pounds of ground elk meat going to do you with no refrigeration? Likewise, as many other things in nature, there's a lot of feast and famine. It's great and easy to get food when there's blackberries in abundance and there's more blackberries you could conceivably eat before they go away. But they may only last a couple of weeks, and then what happens in the dead of winter? If you want to be able to eat, feast or famine, whatever's going on around you, as Psalms 23 says, He prepares a table before me in the presence of my enemies. That enemy could be famine. I'd say while this subject may not be tactical, it is practical and it is manly. If you don't think food preservation is manly, some of the things we're going to talk about today is making beer. Beer is usually considered pretty manly. So making biltong or jerky, that's pretty manly. So if you don't think this is a manly enough topic, hope you'll stick around and at least give me the opportunity to prove otherwise. Again, people have been preserving food for probably as long as there's been civilization. And what's more manly than knowing how to and being able to provide food on the table for your family in good times or bad? With that, let's get into a couple of ways of how to preserve food, calories. The first couple are going to be beverages, but they're still rich in calories. You can still sustain yourself on them. And that would be beer and wine. Now, beer has been used since at least the Samaritans, one of the earliest recorded civilizations. I believe they have recipes for their beer making thousands and thousands of years ago. Beer and wine making is not super hard. Now, I have made plenty of alcohol And I don't actually drink except for communion. I'll have like a sip of wine for communion. I don't actually drink, but I still see the importance of the skill. I still will make it and give it away. Beer and wine, not hard to make. It is super easy to make. In fact, people, again, have been making it for thousands of years. It does not require a lot. In fact, I'll take a little side detour and tell you about a story. My wife and I, last year, were living off-grid, off in 1-point-something million acre national forest somewhere in Arizona. And most of that land is pretty dry and desolate, but we found a little oasis, and what I would just, I guess I would call a little hidden oasis where everything was lush and green and blackberry bushes, and we stumbled upon an abundance of wild fruit that I have never seen the likes of in my life. And I have been all over this country and all over the world. But we stumbled across a giant grove of wild plums ready to be harvested. You know, it's not exaggeration. If we had gathered 100 pounds of plums, we would have barely made a dent. We were limited in the number of containers that we had to put these wild plums in. Just the sheer magnitude of wild plums was staggering that we came across. And again, feast and famine. In a couple of weeks, they were gone. But they were everywhere. And we gathered quite a bunch of them. And my wife, whom I love very much, but she didn't grow up, you know, in the country lifestyle, self-sufficiency kind of lifestyle. I told her, and I don't eat fruit again, but you guys don't know that about me. I don't eat sugar and fruit. That's probably a rabbit hole for another time. But she wanted them, and we gathered a bunch. And so what are we going to do with these bags and bags of wild plums? Well, I told her we could make wine and or lambic beer, whatever you want to call it, an alcoholic beverage with these. She also said that she wanted to make jam. Now, I had canned and stuff before, never made jam. The jam is not super complicated to make. It is fairly labor intensive and energy intensive. Now, if you're living on the grid, that's not a big deal. But if you're living off grid, as times might be when they get tough, without electricity, running water things, it could be quite the chore. But I say all that to put it in perspective. I would say that making jam is at least 5 times harder than making an alcoholic beverage from fruit or grain or sugar or whatever. It's not hard. It's very easy. Basically, what you need is something containing sugars. In this case, we're talking fruit. And you need water. And you don't even need yeast, because usually there's wild yeast in the air that will catch. But if you want to ensure it, you bring your mash, your concoction of fruit and water to a temperature that will kill bacteria and everything else. And then when it cools to a temperature that will permit the growth of your yeast, you add whatever yeast you want. And you can literally, probably more sophisticated ways to do this. I am not a sommelier. You literally just go to Walmart or whatever store and buy the little cheap packets of yeast. And you throw those in there when it gets to the temperature that it won't kill the yeast. You put a balloon on top. If you don't know, it will create quite a bit of gas. That's what it does. The yeast will consume the sugar and basically excrete, for lack of a better, more scientific term, it will excrete alcohol. That's what it does. It's a waste product of the yeast. And it will do that until all the sugar is consumed. So you take this concoction, when it cools down enough, you add yeast to it. And obviously you put this in a glass bottle or something that you can boil. And when it gets to that temperature, you add your yeast and you put a balloon or something on top that will keep out other bacteria and will permit the yeast to create gas, because that's what's going to happen. If you don't have some kind of valve or something like that, a balloon, then it will explode the bottle. And you set it aside and you leave it for a couple of months. When you open it, if it smells like alcohol, you've done your job. If it doesn't smell like that, don't worry about that. You're not going to drink it. It's going to smell horrible. It's a super easy process. The same can be done with beer. You just make it with grain. You don't need hops. You don't need any of that stuff. You can literally just do it with whatever grain, mash, I'm not going to give you any recipes on here or anything. It's not super complicated. And again, this has been used for thousands of years. Jesus drank. I see no moral qualms with drinking. I don't do it for reasons. I'll say briefly is that you listen to my bio. I consider myself blessed to be a very good shooter, and I am almost always armed. If I'm more than a few feet away from the house, I'm armed. If I'm out and about, I'm armed. And I consider it a responsibility laid on me with those talents he's given me to be armed, and not only to protect myself, but to protect others. And I don't consider it prudent to be carrying around a loaded firearm and drink. And since I'm almost always armed, I don't drink. I have no moral qualms about it. Jesus did it, and I'm certainly not going to condemn anything that Jesus did. But historically, this was done for a few reasons other than just the way that it makes you feel. Two important reasons is a lot of times, especially in environments less clean than the one we live in now, water is a lot of times not safe to drink. Dirty water is a major killer of humanity throughout history. And making alcohol ensures that the water is clean. And it's a way to keep that water clean. It's also a way to preserve this grain and fruit and nutrients. It has calories. Survival oftentimes is a game of calories, inputs versus outputs. Now, right now, a lot of us live in an environment of surplus calories, but throughout human history, that's not been the case. This is a way to preserve calories and nutrition. And again, it's much, much easier in my experience to make wine or fermented fruit or grain drinks than it is to make jam or things like that. Moving on to the next one that we are going to talk about, the jam. My wife and I did make, and I've canned before, but never really made jam because I don't eat it, so I didn't really see the point of it, and it's quite labor intensive. But some fruit has its own pectin, some does not. If it doesn't, you'll have to add pectin. But basically, you take all the fruit, take the pits out, the seeds out, whatever you don't want in the jam. You mash it up really fine, and then you have to stew it down. You basically make like a fruit stew, and you boil a lot of the water out of it. And you'll have to add quite a bit of refined sugar for jam. I don't know of any fruit that is sweet enough in and of itself. So you add quite a bit of refined white sugar, which I'm not a big fan of, and you add that into it until you get a very thick fruit paste, for lack of a better term, with the pectin in it. And you add that into jars. And then you would take said fruit mixture, and then you will preserve it, as in fruit preserves, as in jelly, as in jam. And you will boil that down. And you will put that, there's a couple of ways, there's like whole canning systems, but the most simplest way, and realize this, if I say canning, it's not like canning like when you buy a can of tuna in a metal can. They should probably call it jarring, but you do it in glass jars with sealable lids. And the lids have two pieces, if you don't know what I'm talking about, if you've never seen this before. If you have, it's a little lengthy explanation, but basically you have a metal lid with some kind of sealant on it, rubber or something, plastic, and then you have a screw around the outside. And what you do is you put the jar, you sterilize it before, during, and after you put the fruit paste in there that should already be sterile because you've boiled it. You put this in a water bath. You put it almost completely submerged in water in this sterile environment, and then you screw the lid down, and then when it cools, it sucks everything down and makes a vacuum. So you turn this on, you boil it at a certain temperature, and then all this gas escapes, and then you tighten this lid down just enough so that the air can't get back in, and then when it seals, it sucks down. If you've ever opened like a thing of jar preserves or something like that, and you hear the lid pop, that's that air, because there's a vacuum in there, and that vacuum environment makes it sterile. So you take this fruit paste in your jars and you boil the water or get it at a certain temperature and let that gas escape and make everything sterile, that steam, everything is sterile. And then when it starts to cool down, it sucks that lid tight. And then when it's done, you tighten it even tighter. And there you have jam, jelly, fruit preserves. Again, it is quite labor intensive and energy intensive. Not a big deal if you're on grid or just doing it for fun. So if that's not your jam, you can can other things. In fact, the canning I did before that was meat, like canning elk meat, canning deer meat, things like that. You can can it, make your own stew with potatoes and carrots and whatever you want to put in there. It's basically the same process, you just do it with meat and vegetables. You can even cook them right in the can and then seal them up the same way in like a water bath canning and preserve them. Obviously, you need quite a bit of supplies for this, so you have to be set up beforehand. The next method I'm going to talk about is basically how they did the same thing before we had all these, glass jars and metal lids with rubber seals and things like that, and that is potted meat. Some of the recipes we have today, it'll use potted meat, things like liverwurst and things like that, I believe, are derived from this. But potted meat, as delicious as it sounds, is basically like a meat jelly paste. As far as I understand, you take the meat, you cook it really well done, you literally take it and pulverize it and beat it and cook it and pulverize it and beat it and cook it. And at the end, you cook it in a ceramic or a metal pot, whatever you have. And then, that's why it's called potted meat. You generally in a ceramic pot. You could probably do it in glass or any kind of container that you could heat up. You want to make sure you heat up the meat concoction, which is basically just meat and salt. That's really all you need. You can add spices, obviously, and things to it. Nothing that's going to make it go rancid, but spices that are good at preserving stuff. And you take this meat paste in this pot, and you make sure it's sterile and the pot is sterile and everything, and you take some kind of sealant. This can be butter. Butter has been used for this historically, from what I understand. A massive amount of butter if you have it. Also, tallow, if you have beef fat and things like that, and you know how to render and make tallow. Anything that solidifies at room temperature and forms a hard barrier. One thing you could do for this is wax. Just regular old candle wax would probably work. You're basically just using this as a lid. You boil this concoction, make it sterile, and pour the wax on top of this and let it solidify. That way the environment inside is sterile and bacteria, germs, things like that cannot break that barrier of the wax, of the tallow, of the butter. And you can preserve that meat for quite a while and it's ready to eat when you want to get into it. That's a lot simpler to do and it takes less resources. You obviously don't need the special canning jars and lids and things like that for it. Again, historically, this was a thing up until fairly recently. I'm sure people still make it and do it, but it's pretty obscure. But if we get into where food is harder to get and you might want to preserve it, potting meat may become a thing. Probably one of the simplest ways of preserving fruit and vegetables and meat is literally just drying it out. Everybody's probably familiar with beef jerky. You don't need all kinds of fancy dehydrators, and I know marketing will tell you that you need that stuff, but you don't. You can do it in an oven or you can do it outside. Now, if you live in like South Georgia in the summer, you probably can't make jerky outside, I'd hate to tell you, or Florida. But if you live somewhere dry, Wyoming, Arizona, arid places like that, Southern California, you can make this stuff. Just get an environment where you can keep the bugs away, a screen environment or something like that. Trim all the fat off the meat, hang it and let it dry. Well, you can do the same thing with fruit. They're just called fruit leathers. You can do the same with some vegetables. Now, some do this better than others. I don't think you could probably make, watermelon jerky or watermelon leathers. But a lot of fruit lends itself pretty easily to having this done. The water is one of the things that causes the fruit to go bad. And if you can take that water out of it, then fruit or vegetable, you can preserve it. That's basically what a potato chip is. It's a potato cut thin with all the moisture taken out of it. If you live in a dry enough environment, you can literally just hang it outside and keep the bugs off of it. You can also smoke it, which will also create a hot, dry air and also give it a smoky flavor, which is awesome. You just literally hang chunks of meat over a fire. Again, people have been doing this for a long time. Chunks of meat, fish, whatever, smoking them. Smoking is just maybe a better, more insured way to make jerky. And what inspired me thinking about this was last episode, the tactical tip was Biltong. If you've never made Biltong, do yourself a favor, go out, kill an animal, and make Biltong. It is the alpha male version of jerky. I talked about it last episode. I'll briefly talk about it. Instead of cutting it super thin like you would to make jerky, cut it in big, thick strips, at least an inch or more. And maybe the size, a good thing is like the size of your hand. Big chunks of meat like that. And you take it, you dip it in a salty vinegar solution, and you hang it up to dry. When it looks like dry preserved meat, there you go. Done. It's dry preserved meat, Biltong. It is fantastic. You can obviously put pepper and things like it on there. Since we're talking about drying and Biltong and jerky and fruit leathers and dried vegetables and things like that, you don't need a fancy dehydrator. If you have an oven, an easy way to do it is put your oven on the lowest setting. Take something like a wooden spoon or a wooden block, a 2x4, and barely prop the oven open so the air can circulate. You don't want the air staying in there. You want that hot, dry air to circulate out of there and dry everything out and carry the moisture away. Hot air rises. It'll continue to heat up and create a hot, dry environment. You can make a whole oven's worth of jerky or Biltong or anything like that. Or, anything else that you want to dry and preserve like that. It's basically a more modern equivalent of hanging stuff over a fire to dry it out. It won't have that smoky flavor, but it pretty much does the same thing. And you can make massive amounts of jerky in a normal-sized oven. Do it on a day when you're home, and you can monitor it every couple hours. Obviously, the smaller pieces are going to dry out faster. And another tip for this, if you don't know, this is meant to be done with game meat or very, very lean cuts of meat. Don't do this with fatty meat. You don't want fat in your jerky or your Biltong or anything else. This is protein, muscle fiber preservation. All right, next, we talked about a couple of different ways so far. Let's talk about pickling. Now, most people know about pickles. Pickles are called pickles because they're pickled. But you can pickle a lot more things than a pickle. One of my favorite and manliest things to pickle are eggs. My biggest struggle is waiting till they're actually pickled. I usually just throw them in the pickle juice and I'll eat them before they even get pickled. It's just because I like them. But pickled eggs are pretty awesome. If you're from the South, you may know about pickled watermelon rinds, also awesome. Anyway, pickling is a way to preserve food. That's what its main purpose was. It wasn't to make the cucumber taste like a pickle. That's just a side thing. The reason pickling is a thing, it was to preserve that food that you harvested for a time when you didn't have food, usually in the winter. And pickling is a great way to do that. A salty vinegar solution. An easy way to do that today is just save your pickle jars with your pickle juice already in it. Or you can make your own. Vinegar and a couple of different spices, maybe some peppers, is not rocket science, guys. Get the water out of there, add something sterile vinegar, something that bacteria doesn't easily grow in. And add any kind of spices that you want that won't, cause the growth of bacteria. You can do garlic. Garlic is a great preservative and spice. You can do rosemary, things like that. Black peppercorns, throw them in there. And if you like me and my wife, you like ghost pepper and Carolina Reaper and things like that, you can throw some really spicy stuff in there and make some really spicy pickled eggs or anything else. But a lot of stuff can be pickled other than cucumbers. Cucumbers don't actually have a lot of nutritional value. So if you're doing this for preserving food, consider pickling eggs, consider pickling meat. You can pickle meat as well. You can boil and pickle potatoes. You can boil and pickle all kinds of things. So pickling is another way. And here's another little tip. You don't have to refrigerate eggs. Eggs do not have to be refrigerated. Okay, that's marketing and getting you to throw eggs away if you think they're expired or crap like that. Eggs last a long time. And here's a great way to preserve eggs. If you don't know, one of my go-to and usual meals is like 10 eggs at night for dinner. That's one of my standard go-tos. It's good quality, cheap, awesome protein and fat. But anyway, eat a lot of eggs. Let me share with you some expertise here. Eggs don't have to be refrigerated. They last a long time at room temperature. They'll last even longer if you coat them with something to stop that membrane from getting bacteria into the egg. And you can do this a ton of different ways and they all work well. They'll all preserve your eggs at room temperature for months. just wood ash. If you have a wood stove or you routinely make campfires or things like that, you can just literally put your eggs in a container and cover them with wood ash, and it makes them last months and months. If you want to, you can coat them with any kind of oil that lasts a long time, mineral oil, anything, any kind of edible oil, not like motor oil obviously, but any kind of oil you would actually eat, vegetable oil. You can coat your eggs with that, and that just literally creates a barrier to help stop bacteria get into there. Now, God gave you this wonderful thing and all this food we're talking about today to tell you whether something is rotten or not. I don't know anybody that would actually eat rotten meat, because you can smell it. I don't know anybody that would actually eat a rotten egg. If you do this and one of your eggs doesn't get preserved and you crack it open, trust me, you'll know. If I have to explain to you not to eat a rotten egg, this is probably not the podcast for you. But you'll know if an egg is rotten. Trust me. There's no, you know what an egg looks like. You know what it's supposed to smell like. You know what a rotten egg probably smells like. You're not going to eat that. I don't have to explain that to you. I'm not going to baby you like, the safety police. All right, man, with that, just all the different methods I'm going to talk about today, just know that if you think we may be facing a future off-grid or where food is harder to get and you may want to preserve it and start hunting, fishing, foraging, number one, I'd say do that now. If you've never hunted before, the time to learn to hunt is not when you're half starved to death and haven't eaten in several days and aren't thinking straight. Hunting is not easy. Ask anybody who's ever hunted. People are like, oh deer, how hard are they to kill? And they remember the one time they saw one in the road and it didn't move. Well, think about all the other hours you've spent outside and haven't seen a deer. Now imagine you're starving to death trying to find a deer. Especially when everybody around you is likely trying to do the same thing. So, with all that being said, if that's part of your plan, and I encourage you to know how to do all those things, I love those things, then learn how to do them now when it's easier. Don't try and do them when you're half starving to death. But when you get that animal, when you get that wild forage, like my wife and I love to go out and forage. That's one of my favorite things to do with my wife, I think, is go out and actually forage and get wild edibles, desert primrose and prickly pear fruit and all that kind of stuff. But learn how to preserve that food. It's great to bring it home and eat it fresh, but think about if you kill an elk and you don't have refrigeration, or you kill a deer even and you don't have refrigeration. Especially if you live, if you live somewhere like Wyoming, you can hang it up and it'll probably last all winter, as long as you keep the bears away. But if you live somewhere like South Georgia or Florida, what are you going to do with a deer if you kill it and no electricity? All that being said, it is manly to know how to feed yourself and provide for your family. So learn how to do it now. I'd encourage you to at least try some of these different ways. Even if you try it like I do with beer and wine and make it and don't even consume it myself. I would if times were hard and I needed the calories. But I'll generally just give it away. But it's a good skill set to have. And as an alpha male, you ought to be able to provide a surplus to those in need. That's part of being an alpha male, providing for the orphan and the widow and the least of these. That's part of being an alpha, is stepping up and doing more, not taking advantage of. So, we all know the times might be getting a little tight and inflation and all this thing and that thing. Well, you could go out and buy presents for people or whatever, but it'd probably mean more and be better for you and better for them if you could give them something you made. Whether that's pickled eggs, if your buddy likes pickled eggs or might like pickled eggs, or pickled watermelon rinds. You generally can't find those at the store. Or how about, homemade wild plum or blackberry wine? It's super easy to make. Literally, cavemen can do it. And it probably mean more to them than the thing you ordered off Amazon that they're going to put away and forget about. With that being said, I hope you like this content. I hope you appreciate it. If you found any value in it at all, I'd encourage you to think about it a different way like this. If you've listened to this podcast, you've just given me like 30 minutes of your time. You probably value your time. You probably think your time is worth something. Time is one of the resources we can never get back. We don't know when our last day is going to be. Time is a valuable thing. Hopefully you value your time, and hopefully you'll value my time. If you think that it only takes, 30-something minutes to make a 30-something minute podcast, you are wrong. It takes far more than that, especially in editing and uploading and researching and all the other things. My wife reminded me yesterday that it took me several hours to do a 30-something minute podcast. If you think your time is worth something, if you think my time is worth something, if you think this information is valuable, if you want more men to hear it, if you want to spread the message, if you think this is a ministry worth supporting, making men more resilient, stronger, more independent men, if you think that's something worth supporting, if you think your time and my time is valuable and you want other men to have these skills, please consider going to goodshepherdtraining.com and clicking on the Patreon link. For as little as $1, you can become a patron. Now, give as much as you want to give, and if you can't give, continue to listen for free and don't feel guilty about it. But again, I stepped down from my management position to be able to make this the main source of income and improve the quality of this podcast for you guys. It's a labor of love. For years and years I did this podcasting thing, working other jobs to pay for it, to put it out at a loss financially. If you think your time and my time is worth something, you think his message is worth something, again, goodshepherdtraining.com. I'd appreciate that. Tactical tip of the day. This one, actually, I asked my wife about a good tip on food preservation because although she grew up what I would consider a city girl, a suburb girl, she's much into the country living now and jarring and canning. And her tip was, and it makes a lot of sense, get small. If you're doing the canning, the jarring, the making beer and wine, small cans and jars and bottles. The whole reason you're doing this is to take a massive amount of food and ration it out, and that makes a lot of sense. You make a giant jar of jam and you don't eat it right away, it's going to spoil, and the amount of time and labor you put into that is just going to get wasted. That food preservation only works until you crack the lid on that, and then the stopwatch starts to decay on that. So get smaller jars than you think. Get the smallest jars you can find. You can always open 2, but you can't half open a jar. So that's a great tactical tip. My tactical tip, if you're slaying beasts, killing animals, and eating them, there's an easy way to preserve the meat. It's fairly easy and straightforward. Maybe we'll do hide preservation another day and making leather and things like that. But what's not easy to preserve is the heart and the liver. And they are freaking delicious. In hunter-gatherer tribes, they are some of the most coveted and first eaten things. 1, because they're hard to preserve, and 2, because they are amazingly delicious. The liver and the heart are awesome. Animal that splits the hoof and chews the cud. I love liver and heart. It is delicious, especially liver. It is great. So eat it first, especially if you just got a fresh kill. And if you've never cooked game meat, it is, in my opinion, much safer to eat than store-bought meat. It's a much cleaner environment. A lot of store-bought beef and chicken and things like that literally live in their own feces. It is not a healthy environment. They pump them full of antibiotics just so they won't die. But a wild, mule deer on the hills and slopes of, Idaho, pretty clean meat. Don't overcook your game meat. Don't overcook your liver. Don't overcook your heart. High heat, short amount of time. But eat that heart and liver first, and if you're cooking your meat, don't overcook it. Now, today's tactical verse of the day is coming at you from Ecclesiastes. I would encourage you to read at least the first couple of chapters of Ecclesiastes if you ever find yourself caring too much about the things in this world. We're going to start a little bit further on than that in chapter 9. Go eat your bread with joy and drink your wine with a merry heart, for God has already accepted your works. Let your garments always be white, and let your head lack no oil. Live joyfully with the wife whom you love all the days of your vain life, which he has given you under the sun. All your days of vanity, for that is your portion in life, and in the labor which you perform under the sun. Whatever your hand finds to do, do it with your might. Thanks for listening, men. Have a blessed day.